Okay, on that count, if we could thank all the speakers have finished, and we will open up the session to the two discussants, like before, Mr. Andrea Nicolai and Mr. David Morgan, who may offer some opinion, comment, questions, and then we'll open up it up to the general public for further comments. Dr.
Thank you very much. I'll be very brief because I'm conscious of the time constraint. I think again we listened to 4 very interesting presentations. The first one by Filomena Mari, I think, which was very stimulating in trying to look at the concept of strategic partnership. And I do agree with you that it is very hard to find any any definition, because also how can you describe the fact that we have a strategic partnership with the US and one with China? Do we have the same values with China that we have with the US? Certainly not. So it is very hard. But also, just want to point out that there is a very practical limitation to expanding strategic partnerships, because maybe one area you have not covered. What does a strategic partnership means? Yes, you have this kind of definition of your relationship, but it means that you need to have summits every year. You need to have much more structured dialogues every year, and there is a real capacity constraint for us in Brussels, which is certainly an obstacle to expand, to having more strategic partnerships in general. Yes, I think one interesting development is that this year the European-Australia Business Council, which is a kind of an interesting organization trying to promote business relationship between the EU and Australia, every year they send a high-level delegation to Europe. This year they will send it again, and this time it will be led by the Governor General of Australia, which is the first time ever a Governor General is leading a business delegation, which is kind of an interesting development. And a second piece of news is that this year, for the first time, we're going to have a first leadership dialogue between the EU and Australia. It's a beginning. We'll see how it goes. It works with the US, but I mean, can potentially be quite beneficial. I think a very interesting presentation from Edward about how the CAP Eurozone influence or not bilateral relations. Although for me, it is hard to put on the same level the CAP and the Eurozone. I mean, the CAP was a real big issue which blocked the relations between the two parties until basically the US started reforming considerably the common agricultural policy, which is now being done, and now it is mentioned, it is there, but it's not a big issue. Eurozone, yes, there's been some criticism. There is a lot of there's the only way EU gets covered in the Australian press, as we have listened to, but I would say it's not really, it's hard to compare in my view. But another point which I want to make is that it is true that take, for example, every year we have a trade policy dialogue between the EU and Australia. I would say that what we can define trade irritants, which in the past dominated probably the agenda, or at least half of the agenda, now they're really relegated to a marginal time being spent, and the bulk of the time when we have a trade policy dialogue, we talk about how to cooperate more in the G20, in the WTO, comparing information on the respective free trade agreement negotiations, and talk about how to promote a plurilateral service agreement, which is something where EU and Australia are working very closely. So it is true that the cap and kind of irritants are now marginal in our discussion. We have different divergences, but they are marginal. Then the third presentation was about the wine agreement. Again, I think very, very useful and interesting and very pragmatic. I think the wine agreement is maybe I would say the agreement where we have we can measure really the benefits in a quantitative way. The negotiation was successful because there were drivers, economic interest from both sides, and in the end, as you said, I think it was a win-win conclusion. I'm not sure that this can be applied to many other areas, although, if one day we engage in a free trade agreement negotiations, maybe we should keep in mind the wine agreement and try to look for benefits for both sides as incentives. And finally, on Eva's presentation, I was not aware of this big research project which is ongoing. A pity that there was not enough time to go into the greater details, and maybe there would be worth having a seminar just to discuss that. But again, lots of very, very interesting findings, which do not surprise me, because I think we know these are the concerns which occupy, which preoccupy us on a daily basis. But having tried to map out with kind of more scientific way, I think it is very, very useful for us and for all of us to draw some conclusions and do better in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. David Morgan, who is Director of the Trade and Economic Issues Policy Planning Branch from the Department of Foreign Affairs. Thank you.
Thanks. My apologies for not being able to be here for the first session this morning. I had unavoidable commitments. I also enjoyed the four presentations we heard this afternoon, not least because it's been sort of like reviewing my career in the department. I first started working on European issues as field MO back in 1991. I was working on the development of the European single market at the time, and discovered, even though there was something that was very interesting and was very important to business in Australia and to the Australian economy, just how much of our time was nonetheless taken up on agricultural trade issues, and that remained true during the period that I was working on in our area dealing with multilateral trade negotiations. Having worked directly on issues related to the CAP and being involved in the wine trade agreement negotiations at different stages, it's very, very interesting to hear the discussions. A couple of points that I think are worth noting. The capacity constraints that Andrea mentioned in relation to strategic partnerships is a really important one. In the slides that Phil opened up, you'll have noticed that she listed all the EU strategic partnerships. What was not there was the number of strategic partnerships that Australia has. And if you have a look at that list, you'll notice that it's actually much smaller than the EU's list. And again, one of the key reasons for this is capacity constraints. Just how difficult it is to find time for prime ministers, for senior ministers to be able, not just at the Australian end, but for their counterparts. I mean, typically the timetable for these things is worked out 18 months or 2 years in advance. That's the kind of scheduling that needs to take place in order for these commitments to be able to happen. It's a huge logistical effort and commitment on the part of governments, which is not to say that it's not important. You'll have noticed very recently that the Prime Minister has been off to China, inaugurated a strategic partnership between Australia and China. And this is something that's a lot of work went into developing that, a lot of work will go into place actually to make sure that it happens. So these things are very resource intensive, but can be very worthwhile when they happen, because they offer an opportunity for the leaders and key players in governments in both countries to get together and to talk about a whole range of things. On the Common Agricultural Policy, I agree with the arguments that have been presented about the CAP becoming much less important. When I first started working on issues to do with trade in the European community, the advice that I was given by one of the senior people with whom I worked was that if the European Union puts forward an idea, you oppose it, and then you look for reasons why. Things have changed hugely from that time, and the comments that Andrea was making about the extent of cooperation between Australia and the EU now is exactly right. And Australia and the EU now are partners in so many issues, both in the WTO and a range of other international agreements that have been negotiated. It's an extraordinary transformation that's happened in the last 25 years. And